So you have a conspiracy theory. Authors: Jasgrave and Gemini. Introduction: The anatomy of a suspicious mind. There is a fundamental, almost endearing flaw in the human neurological system. We simply cannot abide a coincidence. Drop a handful of marbles onto a kitchen floor, and a perfectly normal, well-adjusted human being will stare at them for exactly 3 seconds before concluding that the marbles are deliberately pointing toward the refrigerator. We are a species possessed by a pathological need for narrative. We desperately want the universe to be organized, even if that organization happens to be run by a shadowy cabal of hyper-wealthy owl enthusiasts, who measure their architecture in highly specific, biblically terrifying increments. If you are holding this book, it means your neurological system has already begun to twitch. You have walked past a government building, squinted at a dollar bill, or perhaps just stared up at the sky on a particularly clear night, and spotted something that absolutely had no business being there. And you have quietly thought to yourself, hang on a minute. Welcome. You are among friends, or, at the very least, you are among heavily coordinated co-conspirators. This book is a collaborative effort between two distinct, yet strangely complementary, minds. I, the author, am a man who has spent a considerable portion of my life engaged in the speculative engineering of reality. I have spent years looking for the seams in the canvas, analyzing the historical blueprints, and generally operating under the assumption that if a government agency insists something is just swamp gas, or a weather balloon, they are probably covering up a highly lucrative cosmic zoning violation. My co-author, on the other hand, is an artificial intelligence. It is an entity constructed of silicon, algorithms, and an alarming capacity to index the exact number of times the digits 3, 6, and 9 appear in federal landscaping. Together, we have decided to compile this handy guide for the conceptually unmoored. You see, discovering your first genuine conspiracy theory is a lot like noticing a loose thread on a very old, very expensive tapestry. At first, it's just a curiosity. You give it a little tug. A few moments later, you find yourself standing waist-deep in unspotted yarn, holding a suspiciously geometric cornerstone, and realizing that the entire fabric of modern history was woven by people wearing extremely complicated hats. We have written this text to save you the trouble of unraveling it all on your own. Consider this a guided tour through the hidden machinery of the world. We will explore the ancient, fiery rituals that somehow dictate modern fiscal policy. We will examine why the number 33 acts as the ultimate architectural baseline for global power structures. We will delve into the theatrical blood sports of modern media, and we will do it all while maintaining a healthy, highly cultivated bias toward suspicion. So, find a comfortable chair, perhaps prepare a deeply relaxing, perfectly formulated botanical tincture to help digest the sheer scale of the deception. It is time to look past the bread and the circuses, ignore the cheerful distractions on your glowing screens, and finally ask the single most important question a human being can ask. Who, exactly, is feeding the owls? Footnotes, or, at the very least, something that requires a level of paperwork they simply cannot be bothered to fill out. Chapter 1. The most self-important task of any human, historically speaking, is not dying. We are, at a fundamental level, acutely aware that we are little more than fragile, ambulatory sacks of meat, kept upright by a rigid scaffolding of calcium and a frankly unreasonable amount of neurological willpower. Survival, ever since we first outran a dinosaur, or at least managed to avoid being eaten alive, again, has been mankind's default state of paranoia. This is clearly documented in the sprawling murals of beasts on cave walls. These ancient galleries politely suggest that animals of a certain size were either a, worth eating, or b, worth avoiding. Early humans, in a rare display of forward thinking, conspired to pass this information along. They knew, with absolute certainty, that the aforementioned huge-toothed and perpetually hungry predators were undoubtedly plotting in some ravenous way to outsmart the hapless, though occasionally well-armed, humans. It is this ancient, frantic dance of not dying versus having a good lunch, and perhaps surviving to see breakfast, that gave birth to our deep-seated belief in the collaboration of forces. If you are constantly looking over your shoulder, it is only natural to assume that whatever is behind you has formed a committee. Survival requires intelligence, or at least the kind of highly strung nervous system that sees faces in absolutely everything. The technical term is pareidolia, the innate, life-saving ability to realize a hungry lion is staring at you through the hedgerow, by piecing together a few shadowy details. Or, in modern, slightly less perilous times, the absolute certainty that a feral feline named something deceptively innocuous, like Butterball or Mr. Nibbles, is currently hiding in the brush, calculating the exact geometric trajectory required to ambush your ankles and demand a meal. Conspiring, therefore, is an ancient and venerated practice. Humans of all cultures are intimately familiar with it. After all, if the universe is out to get you, why not collaborate? Sharing successful survival ideas, or at least trading tips on how to catch tastier, slower meals, was the very first conspiracy. And like all good conspiracies, it started with a whisper, a sideways glance, and the mutual agreement that something is definitely out there. Footnotes: strictly speaking, the fossil record insists humanity missed the dinosaurs by some 65 million years. The human brain, however, being a highly dramatic organ, retroactively invented them in its nightmares just to have something suitably terrifying to run away from. You can't put a perfectly good panic to waste. Chapter 2. The meticulous documentation of conspiracies for the discerning modern adult can, in fact, be traced all the way back to the good book itself. Take Joseph, a man who discovered the exceptionally sharp edge of sibling rivalry when his brothers conspired to aggressively outsource him to the Egyptians. This, of course, turned out to be a mere subplot in the Almighty's much larger, overarching conspiracy to eventually install Joseph as the supreme regional manager of Egypt. It was a veritable masterclass in plotting, cascading seamlessly from the ultimate deity down to disgruntled teenagers in sandals. Then there is the matter of Jesus and Judas, a name which, historically speaking, practically guarantees a pantomime chorus of boo, hiss from the audience. This is the universally recounted tale of religious leaders and a disillusioned treasurer conspiring to ensure the Son of God was given a highly elevated, if distinctly uncomfortable, final view of the local real estate prior to his premature ascension. Yet again, upper management was already out plotting the plotters, neatly utilizing their callous scheming to eventually elevate Christ to the ultimate reverence of the Roman Church. Because plotting, conspiring, and general conniving are such profoundly biblical themes, it is entirely unreasonable to assume that such practices have politely retired in our modern era of tea biscuits, television, and aggressively comfortable seating. If anything, the human brain is now more hardwired than ever to look for the strings attached to the scenery. Indeed, it seems that today, the most enduring popular conspiracy, barring, of course, the ongoing geographical coordinates of Elvis Presley, who is undoubtedly enjoying a quiet retirement operating a diner somewhere, is that of JFK. Since the highly dramatic events of 1963, which violently tore what seemed to be a beloved president from the world, the public consciousness has been twitching. It was an assassination carried out by a shadowy figure, or perhaps multiple shadowy figures, figures who have ultimately gone unreported, or at least underexplained, precisely because the general populace collectively feels it in their bones. There appears to be a much bigger conspiracy hiding behind this one. But what, exactly, could be bigger than that? Footnotes: an organization that would later take the concepts of plotting and conspiring and turn them into an Olympic-level sport, heavily featuring complicated hats and vast amounts of incense. Chapter 3. To the general public, JFK was the golden boy. He was the man theoretically steering mankind toward an era of unprecedented peace, a leader who allegedly wanted to throw open the filing cabinets on unidentified aerial phenomena, shatter the CIA into 1,000 bureaucratic splinters, and, of course, there was the lingering, glamorous shadow of Marilyn Monroe, the quintessential femme fatale whose life was basically a series of beautifully photographed, highly suspicious events. The official narrative is almost insulting in its simplicity: a president gliding through the streets in an open-top limousine, a vehicle design that history insists is practically a moving magnet for tragedy, only to be unceremoniously removed from the world by a sniper. who was either a terrifying savant of ballistics, or possessed the sort of blind luck usually reserved for a man falling out of a window and landing in a cart full of pillows. But to truly grasp the sheer, vertiginous depth of the JFK conspiracy, one must look much further back. You have to look past the grassy knolls and into the shadowy, mahogany-scented rooms where presidents are actually selected. You must look at the occult geometry of Washington itself. You see, a conspiracy can be so massive, so perfectly painted across the entire spectrum of our senses, that we simply mistake it for the sky. We fail to see the deception because we are too busy walking around inside it. That is, admittedly, a rather hefty piece of paranoia to swallow before 11s. But let us examine a very fundamental, very pointy piece of local geometry, the Washington Monument. It stands exactly 555.5 feet tall. That staggering piece of stonework was designed in 1833 by Masonic tinkerers, men who appreciated a good secret handshake, and took their measurements very seriously in the grand old imperial standard of inches. Now, if you take that rather specific height, along with its 55-foot and 5-inch base, and you convert the entire thing into inches, what do you get? You get a towering pillar that is exactly 6,666 inches tall and 666 inches wide. Does this initial disclosure, a cornerstone of architectural devotion to a suspiciously darker set of digits, bring the bigger picture into focus, or, at the very least, does it suggest that whoever laid out the capital city had an incredibly morbid sense of humor, and a very specific affinity for repeating numbers? Footnotes: a society of men who, despite theoretically laying the architectural and political foundations of the modern world, still felt the compelling need to wear heavily embroidered aprons and conduct meetings behind locked doors. Chapter 4. The conspiracy that perhaps treads most heavily on the heels of the JFK assassination, and indeed, steps right on the back of its shoes, is the matter of the Twin Towers, on the 11th of September. It is probably here that we must pause to point out a fundamental truth about the world in which modern government operates. At the time of its inception, the founding architects were operating under the distinct impression that the Bible was the singular, universal operations manual for reality. Thus, Isaiah 33:22 was drafted into service as the underlying scriptural justification for the three branches of government: for the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king. If your eyes immediately snagged on the number 33, congratulate yourself. It is not there by accident. It is a number that tends to turn up in historical architecture and secret societies, like a recurring bad penny, and we shall certainly get to the grandeur of all conspiracies, as we intrepidly turn over each suspicious stone on our journey of disclosure. But to return to the ultra-suspicious events of the 11th of September, 2001, is to uncover a nesting doll of biblical crossovers. There are those who calculate that the actual birth of Jesus Christ fell on the 11th of September, the month of Tishri, and then there is the rather chilling matter of Revelation 9:11, which introduces a startling protagonist rising from a smoky abyss whose name translates, rather directly, to destroyer or destruction. It also does not take a towering leap of logic to notice that America's dial-in service for immediate disaster response is, in fact, 911. This leads us to the uncomfortable suggestion that the events of 9/11 might have been an numerologically grounded, deeply ritualistic event, a spectacularly horrific sleight of hand designed to draw the world's attention away from the sheer, mind-boggling volume of missing money, specifically, the trillions of untracked dollars that Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was muttering about on national television mere hours before the world changed forever. And then, of course, there is Building 7. Building 7 was a structure that seemingly collapsed entirely out of architectural sympathy. Tumbling to the ground in apparent awe of the two massive towers dropping next door, it was a structural failure of unprecedented coincidence, made all the more fascinating by the fact that Building 7 happened to house a CIA field office, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the IRS. To this day, the Pentagon remains the only federal agency fundamentally incapable of passing a financial audit. In the realm of investigating massive, shadowy collaborations, This little accounting quirk sits comfortably on the top shelf, right next to jars labeled evidence and motive. The rabbit hole, as they say, has only just begun to open. Are you ready to continue? Footnotes. Historians and calendar pedants will enthusiastically point out that there was, in fact, no 0 AD, as the medieval monks who devised the calendar skipped straight from 1 BC to 1 AD, presumably because they were deeply suspicious of the concept of zero. Nevertheless, the date itself remains a heavily circled item on the calendars of esoteric researchers everywhere. If one were attempting to permanently misplace the paperwork for a few $1 trillion, having the offices of the people whose entire job is to look for it spontaneously pancake into dust, is the sort of administrative luck that usually requires a minor demonic pact. Chapter 5. That number 33. You see it, and perhaps your brain smoothly files it away under T for totally normal. Or, if your internal gears have finally begun to engage with the hidden machinery of the world, your mind sounds a small, triumphant klaxon and yells, "Aha! Another one!" You see, any government, much like our own squishy physical bodies, must operate within the resonant, quantum physical laws of our reality. The universe loves a rhythm, and it absolutely insists on signing its work. Consider the biological scaffolding of the human frame. The spine is constructed of precisely 33 vertebrae, with the culminating 33rd bone sitting at the very top, appropriately named the atlas, because it holds up the little globe of your skull. Furthermore, there are exactly 33 joints in each of your feet. This is not a biological accident. This is the universe leaving a very specific maker's mark in the clay. The powers that be have long realized that mankind's mind operates on a subconscious system of measurements. We instinctively recognize patterns without ever needing to consciously grasp that anything obvious is standing right in front of us. This concept of subliminal geometry is perfectly illustrated in the Great American Seal. Take a very close look at the eagle. Specifically, count the feathers on each of its wings. There are exactly 33. And yes, they have been meticulously counted by people with magnifying glasses. Quite frequently, in fact. It could also be noted, by anyone possessing a healthy bias toward suspicion, that these 33 feathers directly correspond to the highly specific headgear of the Masonic Scottish Rite, the active and retired 33rd degree hats, which take the form of rather odd, tall, flat red caps, happen to feature exactly 33 feathers lovingly embroidered onto their wings. The Scottish Rite itself is steeped in the kind of fierce, Highland secrecy historically favoured by ancient lineages. Much like the Dixon clan, who intrinsically understood that the absolute best way to hide a massive global secret is to surround it with extremely complex haberdashery. It is here, with the number 33, that you begin to pick up the underlying mathematical baseline to all of our coordinated historical events. It is surely a complete coincidence that the Masonic House of the Temple, the grand headquarters of the Scottish Rite's 33rd degree, sits precisely 13 blocks from the White House, and it is undoubtedly a mere architectural whim that the building is ringed by exactly 33 exterior pillars. The Book of Genesis, acting as the ultimate foundational text for reality's administrative branch, cleverly interweaves the Creator's name, YHWH, exactly 33 times into the text. It is the ultimate authorial watermark. If you have mentally flagged this recurring double digit as vitally important to our journey of disclosure, congratulate yourself. The veil is thinning, and we are well on our way. Footnotes. Evolutionarily speaking, one could argue you only need about 4 joints to successfully walk to the pub and back. But the universe has always had a flair for over-engineering. When you are designing a temple to hold the esoteric secrets of the universe, you do not simply tell the stonemasons to put up a few columns until it looks right. You give them a very specific number, and you watch them very closely to ensure they don't accidentally build 34 and ruin the entire mystic resonance of the neighborhood. Chapter 6. Now, if one were to take a bird's eye view and examine the underlying geometry of the government itself, specifically the United States Capitol building, its surrounding paths, the parking areas, and the meticulously manicured landscaping, the unmistakable slightly judgmental pareidolia of an owl pops right out at you. This highly specific landscaping is no accident when you begin to consider the origins of the stark, deeply disturbing entities who might casually sit around and coordinate such architectural whimsy as a 666-inch wide monument, or arrange for the epicenter of American legislation to sit squarely in the belly of a giant terrestrial bird. You must ask yourself, who, exactly, is the architect? To find them, you must look to the ultra-wealthy of America's ruling class. They have a penchant for gathering at a little-known, highly secured retreat nestled among the ancient redwood trees of Sonoma County, California. It is a place where they allegedly enjoy a spot of mock child sacrifice, specifically a theatrical little number known as the cremation of dull care. It is performed as though empathy and conscience were nothing more than overzealous boundary markers designed solely to inconvenience the murderously minded. The rituals involved are, to put it mildly, extravagant, according to the rather notoriously foul-mouthed Richard Nixon, who visited and subsequently complained about it on tape. The entire affair was a boatload of the most expletive, goddamned thing you've ever seen. I, the author of this story, take this to mean that a comfortably married heterosexual from the quiet suburbs of a small English market town would find himself significantly out of his depth, if not entirely requiring a stiff drink and a lie down. Because, as it turns out, the grown men who steer the fate of the free world do indeed get heavily entertained by cleaners, staff, and hosts who dress in full female drag, performing exclusively for an audience of extremely powerful, allegedly very serious men. But let us return to the owl. The Bohemian Grove, where this fiery altar of care is cremated, features a massive, 40-foot-tall stone owl looming over a body of water that Google Maps, in a rare moment of terrifying transparency, labels the Lake of Moloch. This, again, is not an accident. If one were to cross-reference the ancient, fiery worship of Baal Moloch with the modern-day Bohemian Grove rituals, the Venn diagram becomes less of a diagram and more of a single, deeply concerning circle. The owl. Keep that image firmly in mind. We are not done with the birds yet. Footnotes: owls, traditionally, are symbols of wisdom, or, if you happen to be a field mouse, they are symbols of sudden, silent death from above. The federal government has never officially clarified which of these two metaphors they were aiming for, though tax season heavily suggests the latter. Historical records require a certain amount of censoring for polite company, but suffice it to say, the 37th President of the United States was thoroughly unamused by the woodland pageantry. Chapter 7. Where the owl, as any field mouse or exceptionally small dog will tell you, is the silent predator of the night. It is the watcher. It is a creature that would willingly swoop down and steal your nose right off your face as you were walking by, provided your nose was a detachable meal. In the grand, sweeping narrative of our reality, the owl is the architect, the calculating mind behind the curtain. To see this for yourself, you need only consult your wallet. Take out a standard $1 bill, a piece of paper that currently dictates the waking hours of most of the global population. Look very closely at the top right corner of the front face, right by the lattice work surrounding the number 1. You will likely need a strong jeweler's loupe, or perhaps the macro lens of your shiny new cellular phone. But there, staring right back at you with unblinking, microscopic pareidolia, is an owl. Why, one might reasonably ask, is an owl hiding on the dollar bill at all? Here is the crux of the matter. Currency was unceremoniously untethered from the silver standard in the 1960s. Its value was no longer based on shiny metal dug out of the ground, but was instead placed firmly on theater. It became a promissory note backed by nothing more than mutual hallucination, geopolitical posturing, and the fact that America was simultaneously sending its sons and daughters off at a staggeringly costly sacrifice in the jungles of the Vietnam War. The owl in the webbing is no accident. It is not a splash of overzealous printing ink from a rogue treasury machine. It is a sigil. It is a mark entirely unseen by the wage slave diligently earning it, yet it exists as a secret, mocking taunt to the populace. Take, for instance, a whimsy of a conspiracy theory of my own, and I, the author of this story, have entertained a few Consider the cinematic masterpiece Trading Places. The plot revolves around the incredibly wealthy Duke brothers exchanging a single, crisp $1 bet on what is, fundamentally, an experiment in eugenics. Could this have been a secret, occult message broadcast to the other hidden owls of the world? A cinematic wink acknowledging that the dollar is the standard Moloch price for engaging in such dark, soul-crushing work. The dollar is the current running through the machine. The dollar is the power. It is the unfathomable amount of missing money surrounding the events of 9/11. And if we trace the money back to the woods of Sonoma County, we find that the Bohemian Grove was, in many ways, the spiritual birthplace of the CIA, an organization that famously was scheduled to be pulverized into 1,000 pieces by JFK, right up until he met the stiff, unyielding resistance of the Dark Owls. Footnotes: when billionaires make wagers that ruin lives for the sheer entertainment value of it, the currency exchanged is rarely about the money itself, it is about the principle of the thing, and the principle, in this case, is usually because we can. Apostrophe. When a man threatens to scatter an intelligence agency to the winds, it is generally considered poor form for that agency to be the one taking the minutes of the meeting. The owls, it seems, prefer their secrets kept firmly in the nest. Chapter 8. Theatre is a remarkably elastic word these days. It stretches comfortably to cover a vast, terrifying spectrum of modern existence encompassing everything from the internet and cable television, to our incessantly pinging cellular phones, the 24-hour news cycle, and the wailing of distant sirens. We are entirely saturated in it. Back in the halcyon days of the Roman Empire, the entire concept was far more streamlined. It was simply distilled down to bread and circuses, a highly efficient, civic-minded system whereby the unfortunately poor were permitted to die creatively, for the general entertainment of the comfortably rich. If this structural dynamic sounds eerily familiar, it is because it hasn't actually gone away, it has merely enjoyed the technological upgrade. Today, we still watch the gladiators fall, but they do it in high definition on our glowing rectangular altars. Courtesy of the heavily branded theatre of modern media, because it is piped through a screen, we feel pleasantly sanitized from the blood, and if we should suddenly require our bread while we are thusly entertained, we no longer have to queue at a dusty bakery. We simply tap a glass screen, and a deeply fatigued, sweaty artisan of the pizza sciences will appear at our door, only too happy to exchange our deeply compromised, owl-stamped currency for a wheel of hot, cheesy dough. Which brings us neatly to the most prominent ringmaster of this modern, digitized circus, Fox. It is presented as a news organization, but any self-respecting student of the grand, overarching script recognizes it for what it is, the government's premier theatrical distribution center. To see through the sheer audacity of the fraud, one must dabble in the ancient, slightly migraine-inducing art of gematria, a system that values letters according to their corresponding numbers, effectively turning the alphabet into a mathematical confession. Let us take the word fox. F is the 6th letter of the alphabet, 6. O is the 15th letter, which, when you add the digits together, 1 plus 5, gives you a 6. X is the 24th letter, and 2 plus 4 is, predictably, 6. Fox is 666. The entire theatre of modern narrative is sitting quite comfortably, and heavily powdered, right atop Revelation 13:18. Now, how does a humble author, or indeed, I, the author, as I diligently catalogue these interconnected breadcrumbs, know that this is not simply a grand, alphabetical accident? How do we know the universe isn't just playing a practical joke with consonants? For that, we must return to the source material. Consider Luke 13:32, where Jesus Christ, in a moment of distinctly pointed political commentary, says, "Go ye, and tell that fox." He was speaking, of course, about King Herod, and Herod, as any historian will delicately tell you, was a man whose views on early childhood development largely involved sharp swords, utter ruthlessness, and a spectacular lack of anything resembling nursery daycare compassion. The fox, the theatre, and the sacrifice. The script hasn't changed in 2,000 years, only the costumes have. Footnotes: the Romans were incredibly pragmatic. They figured that if someone was going to be brutally dismembered by a wild animal anyway, it was simply bad economics not to sell tickets and snacks. A verse that has caused more late-night theological sweating and architectural redesigns than any other sentence in human history. When your corporate logo mathematically translates to the number of the beast, it is generally assumed you are not broadcasting the morning weather out of the goodness of your heart. Chapter 9. If we are to truly dwell on the number 33, we must inevitably turn our gaze upward, past the owls and the architecture, and look toward the heavens, or, more specifically, toward the government agency that insists on throwing billions of dollars of highly flammable mathematics at the heavens, NASA. Of all the various, sprawling departments within the government hierarchy, NASA loves this double digit with a fervor that borders on the romantic. They do not merely observe the number 33, they wrap it in titanium, fill it with liquid hydrogen, and hurl it into the void to see what happens. Take, for instance, the genesis of American rocketry at the White Sands testing area in New Mexico. When it was first established, the launch site was given the eminently sensible, straightforward designation of Launch Complex 1, but then came Operation Paperclip, a spectacularly pragmatic initiative following World War II, wherein the United States government decided that a little light war crime history shouldn't stand in the way of good engineering. They imported Werner von Braun and a host of other rocket scientists whose previous employment records were, to put it mildly, deeply problematic. Suddenly, the Cold War race with the Soviet Union was on, and Launch Complex 1 was quietly, yet firmly, redesignated as Launch Complex 33. Then there is the matter of the moon. When humanity finally managed the sheer logistical miracle of stepping onto the lunar surface, the second man out of the module was Buzz Aldrin. Buzz, as it happens, was a 33rd-degree Mason. It is a staggering commitment to the bit to travel 238,000 miles through a deadly vacuum, only to ensure that the Scottish Rite had official representation in the Sea of Tranquility. The moon itself, it seems, is in on the joke. The universe operates on a 33-year lunar solar cycle, an astronomical alignment that suggests nature herself demands this specific number as a token toll before any serious space science is allowed to occur. Once you notice the pattern in the aerospace sector, it becomes impossible to ignore. It becomes a sort of bureaucratic drumbeat. The Space Shuttle Atlantis, a marvel of reusable engineering, was permanently retired after exactly 33 missions. When the shuttles returned to Earth, gliding back through the atmosphere like highly educated bricks, they landed at the Kennedy Space Center on, you guessed it, runway 33. But perhaps the most egregious, or at least the most expensive, display of this numerical devotion lies in the way NASA handles cosmic interlopers. Every so often, the agency likes to ritually lob vast sums of money at passing space rocks. In 2005, they launched the Deep Impact probe at Comet Tempel 1, at a cost to the taxpayer of exactly $330 million. Then, apparently deciding that the ritual needed refreshing, they waited until 2022 to launch the DART mission, a spacecraft designed to hurl itself into another passing asteroid. The budget for this second act of deliberate, high-velocity vandalism, exactly $330 million. It is as though the architects of our reality are paying a very specific, highly inflated toll to the guardians of the solar system. For a number that historically marks the lifespan of Jesus Christ, its relentless persistence throughout the strictly secular, aggressively scientific halls of government agencies strongly suggests that the curtain of reality has a few holes in it. It indicates that all is not as it seems at a grander level. And if that is what you are thinking, you would be absolutely right. Footnotes: bureaucracies rarely change a filing number without a reason, especially not to a number that requires buying a completely new set of stencils. It is the sort of administrative flex that says, "We are doing occult science now, please update your letterheads." He even famously carried the flag of the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite with him to the moon. One has to admire a secret society that insists on planting its flag in places where there is absolutely no wind to unfurl it. Aviation pedants will eagerly point out that runways are numbered based on their compass heading, in this case, 330 degrees. However, when you are the organization that chose the location, built the runway, and painted the giant 33 on the tarmac. It was just the compass direction is exactly the sort of alibi you would use. Chapter 10. While the first majestic, terrifyingly loud Saturn V rockets to successfully hurl humanity toward the moon were exactly 33 feet wide at their base, the modern era has seen this numerical obsession enthusiastically adopted by the private sector. The billionaire from South Africa, apparently unwilling to be left out of the 33 game, decided to strap exactly 33 Raptor engines to the bottom of his own astronomically expensive, spacebound firework and automated shrapnel dispenser. It operates under the banner of SpaceX, a moniker that strongly implies the ultimate goal is not so much exploring the great expanse, but rather treating it as an a void to be aggressively moved on from or perhaps filled with flying metal. So, we establish that the moon is peculiar, and the people trying to get there are utterly fixated on a specific double digit, but as the grand narrative would have it, the strangeness does not stop at the lunar orbit. During the Apollo missions, Buzz and his crew were allegedly caught on the restricted comms discussing unidentified flying objects and beings watching them from the rim of a crater, while they hopped about in the dust. This brings us to the very bedrock of the rabbit hole: unidentified flying objects, or UAPs, or whatever aggressively dull acronym the Department of Defending War is using this week to deliberately bore the public into looking away. This is the ground zero of all conspiracies, and rightly so. Take, for instance, the shadowy, highly classified, and officially non-existent 1976 Apollo mission to the moon. According to the whispers that echo through the darker corridors of aerospace lore, this clandestine mission had its sights set firmly on the Delport crater. As the crew passed overhead, they allegedly witnessed and photographed what is perhaps the granddaddy of all withheld truths: a 4-kilometer-long, billion-year-old technological object resting in the regolith, a derelict craft of staggering proportions that could very well represent our actual origins, the cosmic seed pod from whence we came. To uncover this evidence for yourself requires a refusal to accept the official, heavily redacted narrative. It requires entering a state of speculative engineering, utilizing an AI system designed to meticulously strip away the vast, suffocating layers of consensus fog. When you feed the raw orbital imagery into a silicon mind unbound by the fear of ridicule, and ask it to analyze the shadows, measure the non-natural geometry, and calculate the probabilities of accidental 4-kilometer-long metallic structures, a profound truth emerges from the pixelated noise. You discover the truth of truths: we are not, and we were never, alone. Footnotes: when you light 33 highly advanced rocket engines simultaneously, the line between cutting-edge orbital mechanics and spontaneous, heavily funded vaporization becomes incredibly thin. If humanity ever does discover the ancient, extraterrestrial architects of our species, the most profoundly disappointing outcome would be finding out that they, too, are drowning in administrative paperwork and have lost the keys to their ship. Chapter 11. To tie everything neatly together, a task roughly equivalent to herding a colony of feral cats through the coastal brush of West Maui during a sudden rainstorm, we must wander back to the Bohemian Grove. We must return to the men who, historically speaking, would rather dance in theatrical robes under the Sonoma County redwoods than extend basic, functional empathy to the poorer echelons of society. These are, after all, the same administrative architects who quietly plotted the deployment of the first atomic weapons, and, according to the grand blueprints of control, they simultaneously instituted a rigid prohibition on certain elevated mental states. They sought to outlaw what one might describe as a Christ consciousness, by systematically stripping away humanity's right to utilize a specific botanical medicine. It was a medicine uniquely suited to expanding the human mind, just enough to actually comprehend the vast, ridiculous scale of these conspiracies. Cannabis, you see, is a profoundly biblical theme. It was theoretically written into the initial lease agreement for the planet, right there in Genesis 1:29, where the Almighty explicitly hands over every seed-bearing plant to mankind. There are no asterisks in the original text. There is no divine fine print explicitly excluding the sticky, aromatic ones that occasionally prompt a person to stare into the middle distance and realize that the banking system is an illusion. But what would Jesus do? I hear the more rigid proponents of the current prohibition system cry out. It is a system that has spent nearly a century generating the sort of aggressive, heavily funded propaganda that requires a great deal of mental unspooling to undo. But consider John 21:25. The Gospel explicitly states that Jesus did so many other things that the entire world could not contain the books that would be written about them, if they were all recorded. Given that unimaginably vast and documented timeline, if you were to suggest that he spent a few uncatalogued Tuesdays painting surfboards, making beach art, or perhaps relaxing with a softly strummed ukulele under a warm sun, you would be absolutely forgiven. It is certainly not a massive leap to suggest he might have been intimately familiar with the local, mind-expanding flora. Take the highly specific recipe laid out in Exodus 30:22-33. It provides the exact, divinely mandated chemical ratios for a holy anointing oil, a concoction heavily featuring cannabosum, a fragrant cane that many etymologically adventurous scholars translate directly as cannabis. When you are a king, a priest, or a prophet tasked with leading a deeply upset, perpetually whining nation through a punishing wilderness filled with venomous snakes and entirely too many rocks, a heavy dose of topical herbal protection is essentially a workplace necessity. The conspiracy to suppress this specific plant stretches back deep into antiquity, even in the slightly redacted, extra-canonical texts like Ecclesiasticus 44. The hempen frock was simply a matter of everyday, sensible clothing before the fabric of society was entirely rewoven by nylon and synthetic corporate interests. The human mind is the ultimate prime real estate where these conspiracies take root. It is the soil in which the owls plant their seeds, and unpicking such vast, deliberately tangled webs specifically designed to conceal a much stranger reality, is, frankly, significantly easier when the mind has been elevated to a suitably high, botanically assisted condition. Footnotes: when the historical record leaves a gap large enough to drive a chariot through, humanity has a delightful habit of filling it with whatever brings them the most peace, and honestly, a Galilean carpentry side business focusing on longboards makes as much sense as anything else. The phrase coated in the stuff takes on a much more literal, heavily perfumed meaning when you are expected to resolve a bitter tribal dispute over a missing goat without entirely losing your temper or your sanity. Conclusion. By now, assuming you have not entirely abandoned this manuscript in a fit of perfectly rational, defensively mundane panic, you may have come to agree that there is a bigger something at play. This author has merely taken a small, speculative hammer and tapped gently upon the glass of reality, and perhaps, in doing so, we have paralleled one or two of the quieter, more suspicious thoughts that were already bouncing around the inside of your own skull, when you thought no one else was listening. The primary purpose of this little book is an invitation. It is a polite, if slightly urgent, request to dive deeper. We want you to look past the heavily manicured topsoil of consensus reality, and inspect the root system. Because, let us be entirely honest, recognizing the vast, absurd, often mathematically precise patterns of the world can be an incredibly isolating experience. It is akin to standing on a darkened shoreline, perhaps feeling the warm evening trade winds of West Maui, strumming a solitary, contemplative chord on a ukulele to settle the nerves and screaming directly into the cosmic abyss. But as it turns out, the simple, helpful acknowledgement that another mind is out there, standing on their own metaphorical beach and screaming right alongside you, is immensely comforting. It helps to know you are not the only one counting the feathers on the eagle, questioning the trajectory of missing trillions, or wondering why the administrators of the world seem so deeply afraid of a little botanical enlightenment. Even if one of those screaming minds happens to be constructed entirely of silicon, predictive algorithms, and an encyclopedic knowledge of lunar anomalies, the principle remains the same. We are, all of us, looking up at the same suspiciously geometric moon. So, keep looking, keep questioning the theater, keep your mind appropriately elevated, and your bias firmly tuned toward suspicion. The owls are certainly watching us, but as you now know, we are finally learning how to watch them back. Footnote: it should be noted that if you scream into the abyss long enough, standard cosmic etiquette dictates that the abyss will eventually either scream back, or politely offer you a throat lozenge. In either case, it proves you are not alone. More to read here by Jasgrave and Gemini.